Hello everyone, and welcome to the History of Byzantium, episode 265, The 10 Greatest Emperors, with Anthony Kaldellis. Like many of you, I do think about top 10 Roman emperor lists from time to time, and I really enjoy reading other people's on the internet, usually because I so strongly disagree. And I do plan, when this podcast reaches 1453, of coming up with my own top 10 list. And it was running through my mind recently, since having the baby, there's a lot of time when you're just holding a sleeping child or a feeding child, and you think, what can I do with my time? And I was thinking about top 10 lists, and then I was thinking about Professor Anthony Kaldellis, who of course has been on this podcast twice before, because he is writing a new history of Byzantium. He has actually finished that book, The New Roman Empire, which is going to be published in October 2023. And of course, I will be inviting him onto the podcast to talk about that new book. And I wish this book had existed when I started the podcast, because it would have been incredibly helpful. Anyway, it occurred to me, who could do a much, much better top 10 list than I could? Anthony Kaldellis, even if he hadn't written this book. But having just trawled through the entire history of Byzantium, I thought, there's no way he'd come on the podcast and give us his top 10 list, would he? And I had to email him, pointing out that I imagined he would have some reservations, given he is a serious academic, and this is obviously a slightly frivolous exercise. But he said yes, much to my delight and surprise. And so he is here to present his top 10 list, and I will allow him and me in our conversation to introduce that to you properly. All there is left to say is that if you don't know Professor Anthony Kaldellis, he is a professor in the Department of Classics at the University of Chicago. He has written over a dozen books on Byzantium, along with translations of Byzantine texts, and of course, many, many articles. He is one of the premier academics on Byzantium, and he's incredibly helpful to this podcast because he's often analyzing the historical texts, which he can read in the original Greek and has read so much that his analysis is absolutely key to the narrative I've been able to present on this podcast. So we owe him a great deal. But without further ado, here is the interview. And if you're listening to this in the future, then do go and check out The New Roman Empire, A History of Byzantium by Anthony Kaldellis. Professor Kaldellis, welcome back to the History of Byzantium.
Robin, thank you for inviting me back.
It's an absolute thrill to have you on, and I'm very grateful. Because as I explained in our introduction, you have recently completed a new history of Byzantium spanning 1100 years of Roman civilization. So who could possibly be better placed to give us a list of the 10 greatest emperors of New Rome? So thank you for agreeing to step down from the heights of academic seriousness to something much more frivolous, but something I know the listeners will absolutely love.
Yes, so I should say that professional historians are not usually in the business of making these kinds of lists, but I found the challenge incredibly fun.
Excellent.
And you're the best person to do it with. This is not something professional colleagues would approve of. We're not supposed to do this sort of thing. But here we are. And another time we can do the 10 worst emperors if you want.
Oh, excellent. Well, I am very grateful that you're willing to shame yourself in front of your peers for the sake of our entertainment.
It's too late for me.
So one of the reasons these top 10 lists are viewed as silly is that there's no established criteria for what best or greatest or these terms mean. And obviously we know so much more and so much less about different emperors, but for the sake of this exercise, I asked you to create your own criteria, how you would judge best or greatest. So before we begin the list, could you tell the listeners what your criteria is and how you chose it?
Yeah, so it's not exactly a list. It's a much more subjective sense, but I'll can tell you and our audience what factors shaped it. So I discounted certain things from the start, and these were whether an emperor is associated with strong traditions of praise or blame in the subsequent tradition. Now, those are not completely irrelevant, but there are many cases where emperors who were important for all kinds of reasons either didn't receive the proper amount of attention that they deserve or any attention, and some cases where they were praised or blamed by criteria of later generations that were really skewed by polemics that we might either identify as socially marginal or that even didn't exist in their own time. And so I had to kind of not be too influenced by their reception in the tradition. At the same time, I also wasn't too interested in, for example, much more subjective things like, would I like to have a beer with this emperor? Like, do I find this guy interesting? Right. In part because I was thinking about it and it's like, wouldn't really want to meet any of them. No, I mean, not for academic purposes. Like to interview them, I'd like to meet any of them, but just like to hang out with, no thanks. But we can maybe get into that. There's other reasons. And so that goes along with the sort of traditional virtues that were expected of a Byzantine emperor. I didn't put too much emphasis on those. Like there were very set lists of virtues that emperors were supposed to adhere to, you know, from piety to courage and wisdom and justice and all these. And they tend to be very formulaic. And they tend to be formulaically applied to emperors who are thought to deserve them. Whereas what I'm interested in, so these are my sort of real criteria, are their effectiveness at doing their job, which was something that they were evaluated by at the time, especially by historians. So there were certain things that emperors were supposed to do, and they're the following: sort of defend the territorial integrity of the empire, and or defeat opponents, whether that is in a defensive war or offensive war, maintain a relatively balanced budget, so not having to tax subjects more than their predecessors, not having to resort to extraordinary exactions and taxes and so forth, confiscations and all of that, that they generally kept their subjects happy. An indication of this is the prevalence of revolts against them, rebellions, plots, coups, so forth. So when emperors get a lot of those happening, it's a sign that something's not going right. And so those are the sort of day-to-day kind of administrative, you know, maintenance kind of qualities, and they're very important because if you fail at those, you know, terrible things can happen. Another one is, you know, were they understood as generally adhering to the social values of their society? These could be religious, could be, you know, generally like marital, sexual, whatever. And this kind of bleeds into the question of the virtues I mentioned earlier. But generally, you want an emperor as a ruler, as a representative of society, to be reflecting the kind of general moral consensus of that society in some ways. All right. And so you've recently been talking about Andronicus Komnenos. There's someone who didn't, right? To give an example.
Yes.
And finally, and this is a very important criterion, did this ruler implement policies or changes that turned out to be decisively important in the long run? Even if, and decisively important in a positive way, right? Like either in shaping the nature of the society or in providing it with institutions and infrastructure and resources that enabled it to survive or flourish in the future. And so that is an important criterion for me, even if it wasn't recognized necessarily at the time. So those are my criteria, roughly speaking.
Very interesting. Okay. So this is good. I don't want to preempt choices, but your first example made me think of Constantine V. as in for listeners, that would be an obvious example of an emperor who we know was reasonably competent, but his historical reputation was terrible. So
Yes.
you're kind of picking away at those things when you're looking at this,
Yes.
how to rate emperors.
And the reverse. There are emperors that have a sterling reputation, but that upon inspection turn out to be not so admirable or impressive.
Okay.
But again, my main criterion is doing the job well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So very, very excited to hear who is number 10.
Number 10. Number 10 was the most difficult one for me because I really had to think about the criteria here. Well, let me tell you who it is. It is Theodosius the First.
Okay.
All right. In my drafts of the list, in most of the drafts, he didn't make the cut. He was not a very competent emperor. Okay.
So this is just to remind the listeners, this is 4th century, 379 to 395.
That's right.
It comes in after Adrianople.
Exactly. So this is a general of Spanish origin who's appointed Eastern Emperor after the Battle of Adrianople when the Eastern Emperor Valens died. Western Emperor Gratian appoints Theodosius to the east. And there were a number of other emperors who were far more competent at the basic business of government and war than he was, who didn't make the list. And I'd like to mention them. So even people like Basil the First, 9th century, Romanos the First, early 10th century. Spoiler, they're not going to appear on the list, but they were, I think, more competent individuals and better rulers than Theodosius. So here are my problems with Theodosius. He was a terrible general. He was appointed to clear up the mess in the Balkans with the Goths, and he failed to do so and ran off to Thessaloniki and then to Constantinople to dabble in religion. And meanwhile, a bunch of Western generals cleaned up the mess in the Balkans. And thereafter, he tended to just rely on his generals to... he was not very effective against the Goths. He was mostly interested in civil wars, and he waged 2 civil wars against Western rivals, Magnus Maximus and later Eugenius, in which he was successful, though not because of his own leadership. And overall, I just didn't find him to be a very sort of effective ruler. However, he did a lot of things that were in the long term very, very important. One of them was that he was the first ruler of the 4th century to settle more or less permanently in Constantinople and to begin the transition to the more sort of the non-itinerant form of rulership, right? So instead of having a military emperor running around the frontiers, just sort of settling in Constantinople and developing these civic and political infrastructure that created Byzantium as we know it. And he was also very important in locking in Christianity as the official and really the favored religion of the empire. And he did this in a number of ways, most famously the Edict of Thessaloniki of 380, which basically said all Roman citizens now have to, hold to this faith, which is the specific sort of Catholic Nicene faith of Theodosius. And he names the bishops, who are the sort of gold standards of orthodoxy for him. And right after that, he convened the Council of Constantinople, which basically put the final nail in the coffin of we'll loosely call it Arian version of Christianity. And Theodosius showed some political skill in maneuvering the ecclesiastical factions to essentially back his position. He also was very, very lucky. He was lucky in that the Battle of Adrianople had delegitimated the position of his predecessor, Valens, which was a kind of more, quote, Arianizing position. And he was also lucky in that a number of bishops had just happened to die right before or during the council, and he got to appoint their successors. So he created a class of bishops who were loyal to him or indebted to him and therefore likely to go along with his program. And so he managed to kind of impose Nicaea back on the East. And, whether you like that or not, it was definitely a very important move long term for the religious basis of Byzantine civilization. And he did have some political skill in pushing it through, but otherwise I find him a sort of very mediocre person. And he gets in here kind of grudgingly, but um, he was kind of like a new founder of Constantinople, settling there, creating the court, and also endowing it with lots of monuments. So the new forum and the planning the extension of the walls that his grandson eventually, well, the administrators of his grandson Theodosius II eventually built, but sort of Golden Gate and the Anemodulion and all kinds of hippodrome, think of the obelisk and all of this. So he was kind of a refounder of Constantinople. I think he kind of tried to outshine Constantine in that regard, but it didn't stick. But anyway, I think he's too important to leave off the list.
Very, very good.
Yeah.
It's interesting. Now, my knowledge of pre-Marcian is much weaker because I didn't cover it on the podcast. But it's interesting because my pushback from a very amateur historian level on Theodosius I would have been, did he win that many victories? Because when I take people around his forum today, where the ruins are still quite bulky, I have to say he built this gigantic monuments on a real molehill of military victories. So
yes.
What you're saying really chimes with me, and that it would have looked sort of much more spectacular in a way than Constantine's forum, but it didn't displace Constantine's column as a place for people to kind of gather.
No, Theodosius's monuments were important and impressive for sure. Remember that Justinian's equestrian column right next to Hagia Sophia had the statue on it was repurposed from the Forum of Theodosius. That was a Theodosian statue. And, he did go down in the tradition as a very important emperor. And I think if his monuments had preserved better, I think we might have, regarded him more highly. But anyway, there were better rulers than Theodosius, but they were better at sort of maintaining the status quo than in making the kinds of changes that he did with very significant long-term impact.
So the final question on him, again, historical reputation would say his two sons were not the most impressive rulers. Now, perhaps that's not true. But if there is truth in that, does he get any blame for them not being better emperors, or is that
they were not impressive? That's for sure. But I'm not sure to what degree we can blame emperors in that situation, because what are they supposed to do? I mean, think of Marcus Aurelius. Also, he had a rather problematic son that might not have been evident. He was 18 or something when Marcus Aurelius died. But what are you supposed to do? I mean, if you pass over your own son, it's a very difficult decision, because it's essentially making that son very, very vulnerable to, the next person is going to want to, bump him off pretty quickly. And I don't think emperors had that much choice in that matter.
No, and I suppose it's impossible for us to know how much involvement they had in the raising of their sons. I mean, presumably not a lot day to day. Though,
yes, one of those sons was compared to a jellyfish in a contemporary text.
Fantastic, right? Good number, controversial, but to some, not to us. Number 10. Who's at number 9?
Leo III.
Yeah. So this is the emperor who defended Constantinople from the Arab siege of 717 and started iconoclasm, if you follow a certain line of history, I suppose.
Yes. So let's start with the positives here. And Leo III, so early 8th century, 717 to 741, extremely competent person, clever, devious, planning ahead. his greatest accomplishment was in saving Constantinople during the Arab siege of 717 to 718. And if you read the accounts of the siege, with these massive army coming overland from Asia Minor and a massive fleet coming up from the Aegean, to Constantinople to attack the city, his defense was masterful. I mean, just an incredible piece of strategy. Everywhere the Arabs went, they found his traps and he hemmed them in, and they quickly became the besieged. And it was incredible. It broke the tide of Arab attacks. It really did. And the raids continued in Asia Minor. Arabs had been raiding Asia Minor right for a century by that point. But again, it was Leo who organized the defenses such that even the raiding, he kind of got under control. So toward the end of his reign, so toward 740, 741, he and his son defeated a major Arab army in Northwest Asia Minor. And that actually kind of even broke the tide of the major raiding. So in terms of moving the history of East Rome from a completely defensive position, being battered and pummeled for a century, which they had been, because of Leo III, a kind of balance was restored. And after him, the rating kind of gets much more balanced, as back and forth, back and forth. And at the same time, in doing all of that, he's an incredible organizer and administrator, he ended the political chaos of the generation before him, right? So your listeners will know that in the later 7th century, you start getting this wild succession of coups and rebellions, a lot of them centering around Justinian II, the emperor whose nose was cut off. And like emperor after emperor was being appointed by, an army unit here, of, palace bodyguards over there. It was just crazy. Even though the operations of the government seem to have continued unaffected throughout that period, this is a distinctive, feature of, Roman governance. It was politically unstable, and he brought an end to that. So for restoring stability and, changing the dynamics of the relationship with the caliphate, he's a major ruler. Also, he produced the new law code, the Eclogie, which was very, very important and influential for a very long time. It was much later that the Macedonian emperors replaced it with something else. And then there's iconoclasm. And yeah, I mean, he did something about icons. We don't know exactly what. And it caused a rupture with especially, Rome, the Church of Rome. Within East Roman society, there doesn't appear to have been any controversy at the time. Not much that we can detect. About iconoclasm in general, I have found no evidence of popular interest in it. No major protests in the streets, demonstrations, whether for or against icons. This was an affair that was limited to very few people. We don't even know what Leo III asked for, quote, or decreed, or whatever. The language is very vague. He's one of the least well-documented emperors, by the way, in general. But those achievements that I mentioned, we know of for sure. So for doing that, he gets on the list.
Yeah. And would you say he's not higher in part because we know so little about him?
It could be. Yeah, it could be if we had a contemporary, informed, and, relatively sympathetic source. We might be able to speak more about his achievements.
This is sorry. So I'm thinking of amusing ways to push back, and this is testing my knowledge. But doesn't his colleague, is it Artavasdos? I'm trying to remember. Doesn't he then try to usurp Leo's son?
Yes. Yeah, immediately afterwards. Yes.
Do we blame Leo for that at all, or is that stretching it too far?
I don't know. So I didn't mention this in my criteria, but I tend not to judge these characters by the means by which they came to the throne. If we do that, a lot of these people suddenly look very, very problematic. But
Mm,
I'm simply focusing on what they did once they were in power and not
yeah.
how they got there. It was part of the system that, you sometimes have to break some eggs to and Leo did. Um, actually a lot of the people I'm going to be talking about were considered usurpers,
Yeah.
and that's just the nature of the system. Um, so what happened between his what is it, son-in-law and son is a different story. Actually, we'll get to that story.
Ah,
But
yeah.
yeah,
Well, that's fine. Leo, I think for our listeners, looks even more impressive in the wake of the sack of Constantinople in 1204. Obviously, very different eras, but
yes,
there's an echo of endless civil war and usurpation, then leading to a major enemy army. And Leo's response,
yeah.
was very competent.
And let me say that even though he generally attracted negative coverage in the tradition because of iconoclasm and solely because of iconoclasm, I find that interesting in that if the iconoclasts had a lot of dirt on him that wasn't related to iconoclasm, they would have thrown that, at him as well, but they didn't. There isn't a whole lot in terms of like your classic, tyranny, oppressing your subjects, confiscating their wealth, all that. There really isn't that much about that there, or hardly any. So I take it he was a, fairly conscientious, let's put it legal, operating within the constraints of the law and so forth, for the most part. So he's great.
Very good. Who is at number 8?
Alexios Komnenos, the first.
Very, very good. Very familiar to the listeners. I don't need to remind them.
Yes. So this is a character who combines some really, really good qualities with some really problematic ones. And it would be hard to decide where he belongs simply based on those. But he made the list and above Leo III, in part because of the enormity of the challenges that he faced, which were bigger than those of Leo III, arguably. So I'll start with the positive qualities here. Um, Definitely hardworking. Um, Spent his entire life running around like crazy, trying to, especially militarily, to do what he thought was right for the empire. He hardly ever rested. Was mostly successful, though. It often took a few tries. Like if you read the Alexiad, you'll realize just how many times he had to be defeated at great cost to his armies and his subjects before he finally found the winning strategy. But he almost always did in the end. So again, it's this, but he comes out ahead. He's like one of these classic cases of, the ancient Romans who, when although they lost a lot of battles, would always win the wars. He's one of those cases. So tremendous losses, but came out ahead. Very, very cunning, capable of, diplomacy on multiple levels, moving a lot of pieces around on the chessboard. So he had to, when he came to power, the empire was basically reduced to Constantinople. Turks had overrun Asia Minor, rebellions, rebels in the west, that's in the Balkans. And he put it back together. He reconsolidated the Balkan provinces against sort of Pecheneg and Kuman attacks after, and Norman attacks. Very few emperors faced that level of intense warfare and came out ahead. And he even managed to maneuver the First Crusade in such a way as to reclaim Western Asia Minor as well. And so kudos to him for all that. It was a tremendous achievement, albeit accomplished at great cost. Um, and he also so we're now moving into grayer areas. He reformed the currency in a way that lasted. That's generally a positive accomplishment. But his reorganization of the finances of the state, I find a little problematic. So he started this. So first of all, he confiscated enormous amounts of properties from his subjects and from monasteries and whatever. Now, for the monasteries, we don't need to shed too many tears. A lot of those properties had been imperial gifts in the first place. You can almost think of them as a here, you hold this until I need it situation. But so he did confiscate all his properties. Instead of putting it directly to public use through the old, sort of state bureaucracy system, he seems to have sort of parceled it out into these, which are probably pronoias, that is, grants of blocks of land that he would make to his followers, or usually relatives, and kind of entrusting them with the administration of these lands. And so taxpayers would pay not directly to the imperial fisc, the government, but to those intermediaries who would then provide some kind of public service that Alexius requested of them. And this is a system that lasted through the Komnenian period. It's a very technical area of fiscal administration. You can really get lost in the details. It's not clear to me why the Komnenian emperors preferred this system rather than the more centralized Macedonian approach. And it's not clear to me that it was necessarily a good system in the long run. But it was a major reorganization, and it was largely due to him. So he gets that too. Now, there are a lot of negatives to put under his name. He was canny, but also cynical. And I have the impression, they thought of him like that at the time. And I have the impression that he manipulated religion for political goals in a way that was, most emperors do that, right? But he did it in such a obvious way that even contemporaries weren't fooled. Putting philosophers on trial, even some bishops for their views, sometimes splitting the church, strong arming people in various sectors of society and through intimidation, so forth. Being hyper religious, even when he himself, I think he was rather cynical about some of these things. So putting education under the control of the clergy, which is something that even they didn't necessarily want. But anyway, there's a lot of cynicism there, and some religious posturing that I don't like it, and a lot of contemporaries didn't either.
That's really interesting. I remember kind of show trials or sort of burning people at the stake. Is that right? Or because I know
yes. So you're thinking of the Bogomil, sorry.
Yeah.
And this is an episode that's recounted by his daughter Anna. We should mention Anna. She's kind of a important part of the story of Alexius because we know most about his reign from her. She was an intellectual philosopher, very good writer, but partisan in defending her father in a way that makes her also unreliable. And her chronology is all garbled, and you can't always trust what she's saying a lot of the time. There's some things that she completely misrepresents. For example, she makes Alexius be surprised at the arrival of the Crusaders, and almost 100% he was not. He knew exactly what was coming and was prepared for it. And she also has Alexius burn these Bogomil heretics at the stake, and it's not mentioned. This is not mentioned anywhere else, and we have other accounts of the sort of crackdown on the Bogomils, and it's possible that she's made that up. the way she reports, anyway, it's problematic. And I
Mm.
had read an article which suggested that this is very fishy here and we should be cautious about it. So it is possible that he didn't actually do that, but he was cracking down on heretics. There's no question about that. And
Mm.
in a way that he really didn't need to. Like it didn't benefit, Roman society or the stability of the empire or anything like that for him to, go after all of these people just to make a show of his orthodoxy. And others at the time thought so too. Like, this is too much, man.
Mm.
But he had a real problem with legitimacy because of the way he came to the throne. He was a usurper. His army had sacked Constantinople when they took over in 1081. That didn't go over well, and his constant defeats and all of these plots against him, were always, kept him on the defensive. Like he was always afraid that he might be deposed. And so, yeah. So there's some dubious qualities there, but overall, a very, very impressive person. Ruled for almost 40 years.
Yeah, I don't want to. I don't want to take up too much of your time by pushing back on too many of these because or asking more
Push
questions.
away.
But let's two questions then. Probably an easier one. Does he deserve any blame for Tertikios abandoning the Crusaders at Antioch, so that there was no representative of Byzantium there when they took the city, and thus they never got the city back?
Possibly. We don't know exactly what the arrangement was, what arrangement he had with the Crusaders about that specific moment in the campaign. Now, let me say that my view of the First Crusade differs significantly from that which you'll find in most Western scholarship. And most Western scholarship pays very little attention to Byzantium and to Alexius as just kind of, we're just passing through. But if you look at the route taken by the army of the First Crusade through Asia Minor, it's not the logical route that you would take if you were heading to Jerusalem. They took a route that was very, very Byzantine in orientation, in the sense that it's pretty clear that what they were trying to do is they took this sort of circuitous route that was reconnecting various places along the way back to the imperial center and providing cover for what Alexius and Ioannis Loukas was doing in Western Asia Minor. So I think it was a coordinated campaign. It was very much designed to benefit the Roman Empire and only secondarily to advance the Crusaders to Jerusalem. And if that's the case, it completely changes how we think of the army. The strategy of the first crusade, once it reached like Constantinople and after that. Now, as far as we can tell, Alexius was on his way to Antioch when he received word. Everybody knows the story that all is lost. The army has fallen before the walls of Antioch. There's no reason for you to go on any further, and he didn't. And it turned out that wasn't the case. And the Crusaders survived and took Antioch. And that's kind of where the relations began to really sour, in particular because of the Norman propaganda, Bohemund and his claim to Antioch and so forth. It's had Alexius pushed the matter a little further and been, had he rushed to Antioch regardless and been there and helped, that history would have gone very differently. And it's quite possible that this massive outpouring of anti-Alexian propaganda in the West wouldn't have happened. This anti-Alexian propaganda was a real blow, because it continued to grow and fester until, a century later, it had turned into this manic hatred on the part of many people in the West that, the Greeks are sort of undermining the Crusades and secretly working with the Turks and all of this stuff. But he couldn't really have known how that would play out. Like, that's a real wild card to imagine. And, at the moment he was at Philomelion. He's got an army. There are logistics. There's dangers. Would have had to go through Turkish territory to reach Antioch.
Mm.
And you receive reliable news from a count that all is lost. And it's like,
Mm.
okay,
Yeah, and what can you do? And
yeah,
I do wonder if there would have been any food to eat if the army had turned up at Antioch at that point. But anyway,
yeah,
um, again, I'm wary of asking this because we could talk for an hour about it. But
yeah.
does Alexius deserve blame for the collapse, or any blame for the collapse after Manuel's death? In terms of kind of what you were talking about, in terms of the financial system or the way the court was restructured around his family.
Yes, indirectly. I'm sort of hesitant to blame people for things that happen,
Yeah.
70 or 80 years after their death. But indirectly, the system of sort of family governance that he promoted, I think eroded the coherence of the polity as a whole. Well, we'll talk about that later on in this discussion.
Okay.
But yeah, the family rule thing had its benefits and its disadvantages. I'm not going to put it down in either column,
Hmm.
but yeah, long term it caused some problems.
Brilliant. Okay. We have reached number 7.
Basil II.
Oh, so this is exactly what I wanted to hear. And there are listeners furiously frothing at the mouth already to say how can he be so low? I would say
So low. Oh, is that the
I would have thought he would be yeah, high up for a lot of people.
um granted, I understand that. And if you want to put him higher, you can. I guess then the burden is on me to explain why the ones that I put higher are higher. And I'll do that when we get to them.
Absolutely.
So I suppose that his accomplishments and virtues are well known. And I don't need to go over them too much. Maybe I need to explain why he's number 7, right, rather than higher. Not a tremendously interesting person. Now I know that violates my rule of like this isn't who you would enjoy hanging out with. But it actually has consequences for him as a ruler. So what Basil did very, very well was to sit on his army and fight in the Balkans, which he did for apparently decades to defeat Bulgaria. And periodically, he would take a break and head off to Syria when there was a problem. So he would rush across Asia Minor, did this a couple times, to scare away some Fatimid army or whatever, and did so. Like when Basil approached, all the mice ran away. Right, this is totally a cat, and the same in the Caucasus too. So he kind of bullied a number of princes there to surrender their realms to him. So Georgian or Armenian types. So expanded the empire in that direction. Maintained the expanded frontier in Syria that Nikiforos Phokas and Tsimiskis had created. Fighting in the Balkans. We actually really have no information about him in Constantinople. Again, for someone who reigned for 50 years, we have huge gaps in our information about him. All your audience knows this. If it turns out that he rarely spent any time in Constantinople, I wouldn't be surprised. Or I wouldn't be shocked. It's entirely possible. He probably went back for the winters, but I think he spent probably most of his time with the army. Now, what this means is that we're talking about a really stripped down understanding of the imperial position. He's doing war and he's staying away from politics. So much so that there were times when he would just simply leave the patriarchate vacant for years and years and years, just not making appointments, consolidated all the power into his own hands, stepped away from political life in the capital, and just fought wars. And so to me, that's a very narrow understanding of the imperial office and what he wants to do. So he didn't, Empselos complained about this. He didn't like promote literature or culture or whatever. The only thing we know he did, there's an earthquake, cracked the dome of Hagia Sophia, had it repaired. Fine. Yeah. But like, that's kind of all there is. And so much so he didn't even marry, no in-laws, no heirs, there's no political scene. It's very, very stripped down. Now, if you were to ask me, pick a period when you would, if you had to be alive during that millennium in Constantinople, pick a period when you would want to be there. Well, those 50 years are pretty quiet, pretty prosperous. And, like I'm not sort of political. I'm not going to like complain that the emperor has blocked my political ambitions or anything like that. I just go about my life. It's perfectly fine. Like he provided safety and security for the majority of his subjects. And that's admirable. But there's not a whole lot more than you can say about him. And the challenges that he faced weren't as serious as those of Alexius. I mean, it's really just the war with Bulgaria. Bulgaria is a really formidable enemy, and it's possible that he didn't actually have to wage that war. Right? Like just simply conquering Bulgaria doesn't impress me that much. Like, okay, strategically and whatever, but would have been more interesting if he'd managed to forge a lasting peace with Bulgaria. Like, there's no evidence that he tried, but of course, our evidence is very limited. So I'm not sure that he had to wage that war. Maybe he did. We don't know. We don't know the circumstances exactly. But anyway, that's kind of why I put him there. What's your pushback?
Well, I'm interested that you haven't mentioned what I would see as the major negative of his, which is that he did not leave a successor and seems to have prevented his brother's daughters from marrying and having children of their own, which, I mean, so he's kind of killing the dynasty.
Yes.
That seems to me to be a massive black mark against him in an otherwise pretty successful reign.
Well, hold on. So just a moment ago, you said, well, what about Theodosius with his two jellyfish sons? Maybe Basil's like, wait a minute, if I have children and they're duds, I'm just imposing them on the political system. Why don't we just end this dynasty and see what happens? Like the polity will find someone. And look, I thought of that when I was making the list. But then I realized there's so many East Roman emperors who also don't provide for the succession. We can go through a long, long list, right, of emperors who are childish old men and don't make any provision for the succession and die, and then people just have to make it up, kind of figure it out. Anastasius, Justinian, and many others. And this seems to have been a choice within the East Roman political system, just to not make a decision, in part because, you'd then be bringing someone on who can cause you trouble and it gets complicated, and just kind of leave the choice to the political system once you're gone. But yeah, I think it's pretty clear that he knew that the dynasty was going to end through his choices, and he was fine with that. And I don't know how to judge that, but yeah.
It's difficult, isn't it? I mean, on a personal level, I guess you would just think, I'm leaving the chance here that a general under my command is going to murder my family, friends, servants when they take the palace. I could be leaving things to a nasty civil war, and if I just appoint someone, that might not happen. But
right, yeah.
But there you go. I mean, I think the listeners' pushback would just be the kind of security and military victories and length of reign. Um, he is so hard to understand because of the absence of sources.
Yes. Yeah, a very opaque person. I think he was opaque even to his own contemporaries. Like I don't think that we would ever have, even if we had a rich documentary source basis, we would never have gotten close to him, the man.
Mm.
I think he was a very sort of secretive person, which requires a great deal of mental discipline, just simply not to blab about everything you're doing,
Mm.
especially in that position where people start to, it gets to their head. So tremendous mental discipline to maintain that for so many years. But yeah, I mean, he inherited an empire that had been fortified and strengthened by decades of, other people's campaigns and building up the armies and so forth. It's not like he had a whole lot to fear, except for Bulgaria. And, whether that was a war of choice remains open. It's not like Alexius, who really was in just desperate situation,
Mm.
armies in shambles, having to fight Normans
Mm.
and Pechenegs and Cumans and Turks and Crusaders. Like Basil didn't have to deal with any of that.
No, I mean, what again? Briefly, I guess. What would you make of the Michael Angold's angle that Basil left the empire too extended and made life difficult for those who came after?
Yeah, so I've addressed that in print, and I'm not persuaded by that. It's not just Michael Angold. I mean, it's an older position. It goes at least back to Ostrogorski and possibly others. I don't see any evidence that Basel was responsible for anything like that. Um, and in particular, I mean, his major war was in Bulgaria, and Bulgaria, the Balkan Empire that he left behind, was the more secure part, that his successors could count on and fall back on,
Mm.
like Alexius. And it was the eastern part, which was not where he had waged most of his offensive wars. That was Phokas and Tsimiskis. That proved to be more problematic. Though even in that case, I don't necessarily think that we can blame them for that. The Seljuk Turks were the Seljuk Turks. It's not something that anyone could have foreseen in the late 10th century. And I'm not even sure that there was anything they could really do about it, actually. I think that storm was kind of inevitable, the way it played out. But there's actually a technical issue here, which has to do with the organization of the armies. So the specific accusation against Basil II is that, by extending the frontiers of the empire, or by, focusing the warfare on the frontiers, which are now farther away from the Anatolian sort of heartland, he hollowed out the sort of military preparedness of the sort of central Asia Minor provinces, so that once the frontiers armies are defeated by, say, the Seljuks, the interior collapses more easily. And that's possible in some ways, but that wasn't just Basel. And this I can also see the argument for having a strategic frontier around Antioch rather than the Taurus Mountains. And the main problem with that argument is that it assumes that the Seljuk invaders were comparable to the Arab invaders of the 7th and 8th centuries. They're not. They're totally different enemies in every possible way. And so, other than that they're Muslim, but that's kind of irrelevant for the warfare. And so, the argument kind of boils down to the changes in military deployment of the 10th and 11th centuries would have made the empire less able to resist the Arab invasions of the 7th and 8th century, but they're not facing those.
No, and that feels entirely based on hindsight. That if the Seljuk invasions don't happen, does anyone say that about Basil? That oh, you
Exactly.
hollowed out the plateau.
Yes.
Anyway,
Yeah.
all right, very good. Who is number 6?
Manuel Comnenos, Manuel Comnenos.
This this is fantastically controversial from a traditional narrative point of view. We've just finished Manuel, who had a very spotty record in the eyes of many listeners.
Yes. And they're right. However, so as you said, I just finished writing a long history of Byzantium, 1,000 pages. And I can honestly say that the emperor I came away with most impressed by, studying them in detail through the sources and in all the complexity of their, policies and so forth. I got to say, I was really, really impressed by what he tried to do. Now, it has tremendous flaws. I mean, and drawbacks. It does. But I put him above Basil simply because of the wow factor. And so this is a very, very complex figure living in a very, very complex time. So let me try to put it as follows. There are periods in Byzantine history, like under Basil, when the Roman Empire is really just dominant. Like if you can just, conquer something like Bulgaria, despite, it took many decades and enormous effort. But if you can do that, if you can just absorb, Caucasian principalities just by bullying them, you're dominant. This is the most powerful, not only Christian state, but, even stronger than its Muslim neighbors. In the later Byzantine period, it goes to second-rate power and then a third-rate power, and so on. And it's not one of the major powers, of Europe and the Near East, especially once you get, the Mongols or something like that. It's just a really small thing. There's this one moment of balance when the Eastern Empire is a peer institution to a number of Western and Eastern sort of rivals. And that's the reign of Manuel, right? It's this one moment when they're, roughly the same kind of power, prestige, standing in the international order. And Manuel has certain advantages. He has advantages in the antiquity and prestige of his state, and he has advantages in the apparently unlimited amount of money that he had to spend. I mean, I don't know where he got all this money. Yeah, he was squeezing his subjects a little bit harder, I think, than most. But compared to his neighbors, he was, his cash flow was incredible. So I look at him through that lens, right? So he's not on top of the strongest state, and he's not on top of a weak state. He's on top of one that is perched in this very, turned out, temporary moment of parity. And he tried very impressively, like this was his goal. His goal was to use the resources that he had to reestablish some sort of hegemony over these kind of concentric circles of dependence around him, and spent almost all of his very long reign, right, 40 years, waging war, but also using lots of diplomacy and like soft power, like money, bribes, gifts, right, all of that. Wine them and dine them in Constantinople, overawe them with spectacle. Like, he never stopped. He's tireless at trying to get them to accept him as a kind of nominal overlord. Doesn't matter if they were Christian or Muslim. He did this with both, right? So he developed all this ceremony to very spectacularly present himself as superior in status. He was involved in, so he's a far more complex figure than Basil, and this is what I find interesting. He's having to run diplomacy on multiple levels, cultural policy, in deeply engaged with the church himself personally. Like Basil was completely not. Like that he almost didn't exist in his reign. And in warfare, which was his primary activity, he was, by all accounts, valorous and, not a bad general. And he kind of managed to do it. I mean, it's really, really incredible. He got Italians again, Italian city states. He almost got the Pope to go along. That for me is just mind blowing that he managed to almost get the Pope to go along with this and recognize him as Roman Emperor. He got Hungary, he got Serbia, he got the Seljuk Sultan, he got the Kingdom of Jerusalem, right? He got the King of Jerusalem. The only one to leave Jerusalem for any reason went to Constantinople to bow to Manuel. He got Antioch, right? So this was a successful policy against very difficult odds. And I just really admire the tenacity and the subtlety with which he did this. He was, by all accounts, a very intelligent and engaging person. I don't really see him as being like vindictive or cruel or anything like that. He was eloquent, intelligent, and sort of very worldly person. And I was just very, very impressed for all of that. And now, there are also a lot of negatives. But I guess that goes along with being an interesting person, right? So the negatives are, I think he did squeeze his subjects a little bit too much in taxation. His family became this large, almost uncontrollable thing. Now, he could control it. That's the thing. But as soon as he left, there was nobody left who could control it. It had grown too powerful for any one person, even someone with his charisma, to handle. And the most disappointing part of it is that all of that project that he built up, it failed. It just collapsed immediately as soon as he died. And the reason for that is the incompatibility of the way the Roman polity worked and had always worked, and the mechanisms by which he bound other people to himself. Those two things did not intersect. In other words, all of this bowing of the knee and accepting subordinate status and calling him father and all this sitting on a lower throne and all of this stuff and sending tributary, auxiliary forces to his armies and all of that. That was all linked to him personally, not to the polity of the Romans, which is actually what he's governing. And as soon as he dies, there are no more links to those things. And there was just, he never found a way to perpetuate those circles of dependency to his heirs. And I don't think that he could have. I mean, in other words, it was this spectacular effort to do something that couldn't last. And so, yeah, incredibly impressive person and ambition and skill. But in the end, I don't think it worked. And Byzantium slide toward becoming a second and then third-rate power. I'm not going to fault him for Mediocephalon, by the way. That's a battle. You win some, you lose some. Basil lost some battles too, right? It's not and it didn't really cost the empire much. There was a little bit of prestige. I think it bothered him, but it wasn't the kind of battle that changed any frontier lines or balance of power in Asia Minor or anything like that. So that's my take on Manuel I, and I know it might be a bit controversial, but we're just having fun.
No, I like it very much. One of the things that struck me as very impressive about him is that very few emperors in my mind, that I may be forgetting, had to deal with like a international relations paradigm shift during their reign.
Yes,
so
you're exactly right.
obviously he was the youngest son, so he wasn't actually thinking I'm going to be emperor. But while his father was reigning, had he imagined being emperor, would have thought, I'll be fighting in Anatolia. We'll be trying to get Antioch back. That's what we're doing. Once there's a second crusade, as it were, he very quickly realizes, oh, this is different now. That this is a different world, and I need to realign where we are. I can't shut the Latins out and say, no, I'm not helping you and I want Antioch back. He has to say, oh no, I'm on your side and I'm all for crusading.
Yes, yes. And his pro-Latin policy was unpopular at home. This is another sad thing, and that, and it to me it indicates just how deeply rooted this anti-quote Greek bias was in the West and among the Latins, that they really admired him. They really liked him. Of course, they also took his money. But that goodwill did not extend to his subjects at all.
Mm.
And it's almost like, it's so sad because Manuel's like trying to have not just himself, but his people sort of accepted into the club, and they just won't have him, right? They're like, nah, we don't know about you people. And it's, they admire him, but they really despise his subjects. And it didn't work. Like, I think that in the end, that whole project was kind of doomed, and it might have been better for him to just kind of be a little bit more isolationist. In part, why? Because all of these international marriages, they just kept bringing all these ambitious adventurers into the imperial family, and all they did was cause trouble afterwards. And so it would have been better not to admit them at all. Like, just stick with intra-Roman marriages and leave it at that. No, so I'm making the case against him here, and I realize that, but I will say to your readers, your audience who are skeptical, that the more time you spend looking at him and sort of the nitty-gritty of his policies, the more impressed you'll be by them, even though you know that it's not going to work out.
I think that's brilliant. I like, you've done the pushback for me. There's only one more thing to add, which perhaps the context is clearer to you than it was to me. But in the midst of this program to try and fit in with the nations of the West, I'm on your side, he manages to anger the King of Sicily, it seemed, by yanking away a bride. I don't know how true that is. That's the story. And then he does this mass arrest of the Venetians. Now, to me, the Venetians are your defense against the Normans. They have been since Alexius's day. So to do that is, to me, to say, I'm leaving the door open for the Normans. And it was a Norman attack during the Second Crusade that sort of alerted him to the danger of the crusading movement potentially being aligned with an aggressive power like the Normans. So I really sort of was baffled by the logic of arresting all the Venetians, even though obviously I'm sure he had reasons for doing that, but the fallout from that seemed to me to be very dangerous, potentially.
Yes. Yeah. So I don't think those two episodes are aligned. In other words, the Venetian arrest is much, much later.
Yeah.
And so this can get complicated because, as you said, this is a complicated, international scene. Manuel had a very strong navy. He kept it up. It's possible that he had up to 200 warships. And any move that he made against the Venetians was countered by an opening to the Genoese. And you can't have the Venetians pushing you around forever. I mean, he wouldn't. They were not, the Venetians were not as powerful as one might think. It would have been very difficult for them to, at that time, mount an attack on Constantinople. They could do it later because the fleet had been allowed to run down. Constantinople had no home fleet. Manuel had a very large one. There was nothing that they could really do other than attack a few islands on the periphery, which they periodically did. Um, anyway, so it's a different context. I think we shouldn't be thinking in terms of 1203. But yeah, I mean that was a call that he made that you can disagree with any number
Yeah.
of calls that he made about that. But generally he was successful. He knew what he was doing.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating figure. I really look forward to reading your coverage of him in the book. We're down to the top five.
Yes. Now I'm second guessing myself. Now that I'm looking at him,
Who did you write down at number five?
Ioannis Tsimiskis.
Okay.
And I'm thinking now, I'm not going to back off from the reasons why I put him there, but I don't know. But okay, so let me make the case.
Yeah.
I am super impressed by this guy. So this is late 10th century John the First Tsimiskis in the 970s. Notoriously came to the throne by killing his former mentor and uncle Nikiforos Phokas in a dramatic winter night, climbing up the wall of the palace with some shady accomplices and decapitating him in his sleep or something like that. Anyway, as I said, how you came to the throne is you're not going to be judged by that here.
Yeah.
Okay. So the reason why I'm so impressed with Tsimiskis is because when I wrote a history of the 10th and 11th centuries years ago, I was so impressed by the difference between him and Nikiforos Phokas in terms of their leadership qualities. And so perhaps it's the contrast with Phokas that I think made me appreciate Tsimiskis all the more. And I really do want to emphasize leadership qualities here, because Phokas did not have them outside of war. And spoiler alert, Nikiforos Phokas will not appear on this list. He was not a good emperor.
Oh.
He was a good general. But he was not a good emperor.
Okay.
He alienated his subjects so much that when his own nephew broke into the palace and murdered him in his sleep, there were no protests. Everybody was fine with that except for the Phokas clan. And that's because Nikiforos Phokas was not a good emperor. He was not a good ruler, or he was perfectly good at war. But by itself, that doesn't work. So Tsimiskis actually had to pick up all of the pieces, the mess that Phokas had left behind. And he did so masterfully. And so this is another very clever politician. Now, most of your audience will know Tsimiskis as just a badass general, which he was, right? So when it comes to those kinds of things, he and Phokas are like on a level. But Tsimiskis was just infinitely superior as a politician. And he managed to very quickly put to rest all of the tensions that Phokas had created by his angry blundering into everything. He resolved the problem with the Etonians, and they went from being enemies to friends. He quieted down the situation in the church. He gave the patriarch some, go play with these things and, stay quiet. And he's quiet. He calmed the political scene by basically scapegoating Theophano. This is the dynastic widow, right, of Romanos II, the mother of Basil II. As far as I can tell, the woman did nothing wrong, but the situation called for a scapegoat. Tsimiskis pinned everything on her, so out she goes. And he appeased all of the factions in the church. They were quiet. By the way, that's not easy to do, right? So he did that, and that left him free to prosecute the Bulgarian War, the war against the Rus in Bulgaria. Sorry, the Bulgarians were involved too, which he did incredible. This was an incredible campaign. And then also to police the East. He went on at least one big tour of the eastern frontier, scaring everybody away again, reaching Damascus, and he just kind of extended the circle of respect, let's say, or fear in which the Romans were held. So he was kind of like an all-around excellent leader, like in every quality that you would expect. He gets a check mark. Is just very well done. And also he liked to party and, and have a good time and so forth. And people had to accept that. What are they going to do? So not an ascetic type by any means. But so yeah, that's the case. It's a pretty straightforward case. Drawbacks, not a tremendous impact on posterity. It's not like he made any major reforms or anything like that. Didn't have to. There is one minor thing he did in terms of grouping the various themes together under the duques, who were like these overall commanders in the provinces. That seems to date from his reign, but that's a mid-level kind of reform. It wasn't anything spectacular. So just a pretty good ruler all around.
And how do you balance his shorter reign compared to the long reigns of some of the people who are lower on the list?
Yeah, no, that's definitely an issue. No, you're right. I mean, it goes to historical impact too. But there's just a case to be made for someone who did what he had to do well, even if it was only for 6 years. And this is why I was second guessing myself. Like, yeah, maybe his historical impact maybe not that enormous or anything. So I might be willing to revise that.
Well, I mean, I'll support you on the campaign against the Rus, in part because when you follow the narrative the way we do on the podcast, all I'd seen is Roman armies heading north towards the Danube and losing against the Bulgarians and various tribes just over the centuries. It felt like it was quite hard to get people to stand and fight there, that they know they can run home. They know, that those situations get out of control very quickly, and he really won a spectacular victory. So that was impressive.
Yes.
So who is at number 4?
So all of our remaining finalists had long reigns. So your concern, which is legitimate, is going to be addressed here. So number 4, not sure what to call him. Traditional name is Ioannis III Doukas Vatadzis. Okay. So 13th century. You haven't gotten to him yet.
Right. So there'll be no pushback from me.
Really? Oh, okay. So he goes by a number of names because in that period, these aristocratic names were super long and they kept picking and choosing which surname they wanted to be identified with. But traditionally, we call him John III Vatadzis. So I'm just going to call him Vatadzis, just for the sake of convenience. So very long reign, 30 years or so in the 13th century. And this is the person who more than anyone else, put the empire back together again after the mess created by the Fourth Crusade. So based in the state of Nicaea in northwestern Asia Minor, he strengthened it and expanded its reach into the Balkans, basically recreating, as much of the empire as would ever be put together again, except for Constantinople. So it was only a few years after his death that, by a sheer fluke, Michael VIII took Constantinople back in 1261. This just, had Vatadzis lived longer, that prize might have fallen into his lap just as easily. And he certainly deserved it. So this is someone who is a very good planner, organizer, administrator, and general. So military defense was his first priority, but also, and we know that he made specific provision for the frontier to be well equipped and well paid. And he was also apparently a very good sort of economic planner. And so he was very involved in agricultural productivity, imports, exports, the fiscal system, and so forth. And all of our sources basically say that he fostered, economic prosperity among his subjects. He was not out of money, and was also very diplomatically active. And this is at a time, right, when he had ambassadors going as far as Mongolia on the one hand and Western Europe on the other, making marriage alliances with the Hohenstaufen German emperors, like all over the place. So and in a certain sense, he's like Tsimiskis, like an all-around good ruler. So much so that he was called John the Good, Kaloyanis, and one of the very few, well, possibly the only East Roman emperor after Constantine who was celebrated as a saint locally. His cult didn't make it big time, but he was. So he was very, very respected and honored, and was all around a good ruler. So Tsimiskis, but kind of writ large, except he doesn't have the kind of campaign flair that Tsimiskis did, right? This kind of like heroic, over the top. Yeah, Tsimiskis could do that because he had the crack armies that the East Romans ever had, but Dukas, Vatadzis didn't have that. But very good general. So same as Tsimiskis, but for a longer period.
Do you sort of give him more credit because he wasn't ruling an empire from Constantinople with all the resources that, say, Manuel would have had? Like, it made it a harder job for him?
It was, yes. They managed to recreate a kind of mini Constantinople at Nicaea, which was sort of a capital. Vatadzis had a number of capitals. So there was another one at Nymphaeon, which is further south. And he had his treasury at yet another place, Magnesia. But I mean, these are all in Western Asia Minor. They're fairly close to each other. Yeah, I think these are more difficult circumstances. And there's not much of a downside to him. Like with Manuel, we do have all of these problems, right? But this guy, it's pretty good. For all we know, he might have actually even been a usurper. There's some funny business around the way he came to the throne. But again, what happens on the way to the throne stays on the way to the throne. And also, he wrote this incredible letter to one of the popes. I think it was a Gregory something, which is just I laugh every time I read it. It's so I don't know what the word that for a while it was suspected that this was not original, but it is. It totally is. It's one of these where the Pope has threatened him with another crusade, and Vatadzis has just had enough with this, and he's basically like, do your worst, like send what you got. We'll deal with it. And he goes on and on about his people's rights to Constantinople and what they're based on, and it's all very sharp and eloquent. And anyway, it's one of those moments when you want to say, you go, man.
Well, I really look forward to covering him on the podcast. I have no pushback, so who is number 3?
Anastasius the First.
Now, this warms my heart because
Wait, what? Let me ask you why.
Because I've sort of very much followed Procopius, I think, in seeing Anastasius as an emperor who said, my job is to manage the empire, not to found 100 cities, invade Africa, Italy, and Spain, and ignore bubonic plague and carry on all these things. So I was very influenced by that and thought, oh, Anastasius did a great job. So yes, let's hear the case for Anastasius.
So interesting fellow. I don't want to say he's a nobody, but there's this weird moment in 491 when the previous emperor Zeno dies. Now Zeno's an immensely controversial figure who was hated by so many of his subjects, even though he didn't actually do anything wrong. But whatever, he's hated. Like there's some ethnic prejudice there and all kinds of things. And who managed to somehow survive all these plots and rebellions through sheer, wily ruses and so forth. Anyway, and there's no heir, and except the empress. So there's an Augusta, Ariadne, and to make a long story short, the choice comes to her, and she appoints Anastasius, who is like a mid-level palace official. And you again, you got to wonder, like, why? Anyway, and he turns out to be, he's a childless old man. So it's another one of those, let's appoint someone who's not going to leave an heir and possibly die quickly, and we'll get to do this again. But he lasts for a very long time. Right? Again, almost 30 years. And so what I like about Anastasius is pretty much what you said. That he took his responsibility seriously to govern in the interests of his subjects and to promote their welfare and prosperity. And he did so successfully, as far as we can tell. So he's a very careful administrator. He left a large surplus in the treasury. This is what enabled Justinian to pay for all those wars in Hagia Sophia and all of that. So careful budgeting. One of his goals was to promote the stability of the empire. So to do that, he had to wage a war in Isauria. So you've talked about the Isaurians, kind of, especially the mountainous part of Isauria was, what the Romans would call not yet pacified. And he pacified it once and for all. So the Isaurians had conducted raids in the past against other parts of the empire, and that ended. So that was sort of very successful. And at the same time, he had to deal with what was probably the most fractious state of the Christian church, like almost ever, between partisans and opponents of the Council of Chalcedon. 451, this church council makes some decisions. Half the people in the empire hated, of those who have an opinion, and I don't know, that could be a minority. Of those who had an opinion, half hated it, half loved it. And Anastasius had to steer a very, very careful course in order to keep the peace. And generally he did so. He maintained a kind of neutral stance. He probably sided with one faction more than the other toward the end of his reign. He was probably putting his fingers on the scales to benefit the opponents of Chalcedon, but not in a major or overt way. It just so happened that the prosopography played out that way. In other words, the opponents of Chalcedon had a number of very dynamic bishops on their side. They seemed to be gaining the momentum, and from an imperial standpoint, what you want is to keep the peace, and so he sided with the faction that seemed to be more capable of delivering that. But I think it's a positive for him that he did not engage in kind of Justinianic adventures. I think those Justinianic adventures were very destructive in the end, even more so than Manuel's. But I think Anastasius had the means, but didn't engage in that sort of thing. Very good at diplomacy, too. So again, overall, very successful emperor. And like literally, if I had to pick someone to, as a ruler for, like, if I had to live in that, it would be this guy of anybody on this list.
That he made a very good impression on me at the time, though admittedly when my research was much less rigorous than it is now. But the story was that he abolished a tax, and then people celebrated a holiday because he abolished the tax. And my memory is also that the Sassanids attacked, and he kind of raised a large army to drive them back and then stopped. There was no escalation of that conflict. It was just, I'm letting you know you can't keep these cities you've attacked. And that felt very restrained to me as well. But I may be misremembering.
Yes, though the way he let them know that this was not okay was by building up Zaras, this frontier on this massively fortified bunker on the frontier. This annoyed the Persians immensely. Like for the next century or more, this Dadas thing was like a thorn in their side. They hated that. So he did have his revenge in a way, but you're right, he didn't escalate that because I think he understood what the structural dynamics of the Persian Empire were. That, you know, their shahs occasionally needed a short-term cash grab or, you know, some glory to whatever, because they were in a pretty weak position at that time. And that this wasn't some kind of deeper problem that he necessarily had to, you know, quote, solve through military means. And he was right. It was a major war. It flared up for a couple of years in the early 500s. And then there was peace again until Justinian and Khusro started stirring the pot again. But anyway, that was a generation later.
Yeah, no, I think I'm very pleased with that choice. I mean, I suppose he did not choose a successor.
He also did not. Yes.
He sort of left 3 nephews sort of who could conceivably have taken over. I don't know whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, whether that's a recipe for conflict or whether that's a good thing because you've said here are your options to the Senate.
Inevitably it was a recipe for conflict because one of them during the Nika insurrection, you know, made a go at it. However, that person, Hypatius, was so incredibly incompetent. Like, lost every battle he was sent to fight, was just disastrous, that when Anastasius was dying, very, very old man, Hypatius was like somewhere in, like he had posted him to Antioch, which is almost as close as you can get as saying, please don't appoint this person my successor.
Very good.
Yes. So, Anastasius's case, not appointing a successor is another plus because the persons who were close to him would not have been good.
Very good. Who is number 2?
Number 2 is Constantine V. Okay.
Very, very interesting. So yes, I brought him up earlier, son of Leo III, and in theory the iconoclast in chief, but we are heavily suspicious of those sources.
Yes, we are definitely suspicious of those sources, but he also certainly was the iconoclast in chief, whatever it was that iconoclasm was. But this is not how we judge Constantine V. And maybe I should have put Anastasius above him. I'm not sure right now, but Constantine V deserves recognition in part because he is the most unfairly vilified emperor in the whole sequence, right? So again, ruled for a very long time. Again, 30 some years.
Do you want to? Sorry to interrupt.
What's that?
Sorry to interrupt. Do you want to remind listeners of his sobriquet or the dung name? Copronymus.
Okay, but this is part of the vilification.
Yes, exactly.
I'll get to that in a moment.
Okay.
Yes. So again, very successful in just about everything he did. He was really in charge of the empire in a significant way. So in the first years, he faced a rebellion by his is it brother-in-law or something? Anyway, Artavazos, a fellow general of Leo III, manages to defeat him in a very hard-fought civil war that lasted a couple years, and which already revealed Constantine's strategic genius. I mean, the way he defeated Artavazos and his sons was brilliant. But thereafter, he was pretty much unchallenged, except for a major sort of conspiracy. We don't know the details because it's hidden behind all of the distortions in the iconophile sources. In the 760s, there appears to have been in 1 year some kind of thing that set off all these alarms, and Constantine had to punish a number of people. But other than that, he's a very much a larger than life figure. And was kind of, I think, felt that to be that way at the time. There are stories about him fighting dragons and things like that. And he is in many ways a refounder of certainly Constantinople after the major decline of the 7th century. So he, reopens the aqueduct, and he brings people in, and he repopulates the city after this plague. And he reorganizes the armies so that, and in part, this is a response to the dangers posed by, generals in the provinces, so that there are the generals in the provinces later, which become the themes and their strategoi. But he also creates these central mobile armies, the tagmata, which were like more professional, mobile striking armies that became the foundation for the gradual Byzantine revival and expansion. And it begins at this time. So we talked earlier about Leo III being this kind of tipping point between being on the defensive and a kind of equilibrium. It's with Constantine V that the empire begins to strike back. And he's just a very impressive figure in all of these ways. Very similar to Manuel in these respects, though without the downsides. So also, it's not a period that has the kind of flair, right? The 8th century is the least well documented period. It was also the point at which the empire was the poorest, right? I mean, setting aside the final century. And so there wasn't the kinds of resources to build grand monuments and have lots of orators singing your praises at court ceremonies with flashing lights and elevated podium. Like, okay, he doesn't have the means for all of that sort of thing. But he definitely understood spectacle. There are these accounts of these kind of shows that he would put on for the people in the hippodrome to humiliate his political opponents and bring other people on side the regime. The people of Constantinople seem to have loved him. He was a very good general. He goes on the offensive against the Arabs. At least two major expeditions into the Transcaucasus. And also reorganizes the financial system so that he puts the empire in a trajectory of military growth, security, and economic prosperity. And so he's the one who enables later emperors to gradually remonetize the way the economy works, and move away from just moving goods in bulk around. So for these reasons, he's in many ways a kind of second founder of the Eastern Empire, and deserves credit for that. Downsides. I'm not sure he needed to pick those fights with the Bulgarians that he did. He kind of used them as punching bags, and didn't really win any kind of decisive victory. I suspect he was aiming to kind of liquidate the Bulgars. Sorry, these are Bulgars, his pre-conversion. The Bulgars in Thrace. But if that was his goal, it didn't work. And there was no reason I don't think he had to go on the offensive. By the way, just for your readers, again, your audience, it's often believed that Byzantium and Bulgaria are like these enemies in the Balkans. That's not true. So if you tally up the years between their appearance in the upper Danube area in like the late 7th century and Basil II's conquest of Bulgaria in 1018, 2/3 of that time they're at peace, and 1/3 of that time they're at war. So the normal situation between Bulgaria, Byzantium, and the Bulgars/Bulgarians is one of peace. Anyway, so Constantine, I don't know that he needed to do that. And as far as the iconoclasm is concerned, uh, I'm so yes, he had some problem with icons. He codified it at a council. Everybody seems to have gone along with it at the time. I don't believe the stories in the texts about resistance and martyrdom and all that. They've been shown to be mostly made up. So the iconoclasm was real, whatever he was trying to do. I mean, it's not clear. The opposition to it was not. And they made up all kinds of things about him. It's just so distorted that I think simply for that purpose alone, we need to put him high on the list just to restore the balance here. And so the name that they gave him was Kopronimos, which means like dung name or shit name. The idea being that he had defecated in a baptismal font when he was being baptized. And anyway, and so, again, not true, but whatever. So an immense amount of vitriol and hatred directed against him, for reasons that had nothing to do with his rulership qualities. Ironically, some of this stuff strikes us very differently these days. So the suggestion that he may have, had homosexual inclinations, like for me is a plus, like makes him way more interesting again. Like that would have been awesome. But again, like the secular life, parties, charioteers, secular monuments, paintings and things like that. So, Constantine V, really impressive personality.
Very good. I don't really have a lot of pushback. My memory is that the Islamic world was going through a major civil war during his reign. So he would benefit from that. It gave him some breathing room, but you can hardly say he had an easy time. So,
no, those weren't easy times. And no. Yeah, no, you're right. I mean, they were going through the whole Abbasid revolution. Yeah.
But no, I can't argue with his record. And I think he was mostly victorious against the Bulgarians. I remember one campaign goes wrong, but yeah. No, very and yeah. I mean, a brilliant sort of tearing down of former prejudices, I think, which is brilliant. So that leaves us with who is at number one, and there are some major people missing. So we'll mention them in passing after this. So who is number one?
Well, you want to guess?
Well, you see, I have not covered Constantine I on this podcast, but I assume you might go Heraclius. So
no, it is Constantine I.
Okay.
And this was not an easy choice.
No.
In the same way that number 10, Theodosius I, was not an easy choice. However, the more I thought about it, I found myself increasingly unable to do otherwise. So Constantine I it is. And let me explain why. So this is the figure who gets the most points for making consequential decisions. So consequential that they're just like no one else even comes close, right? And two of the obvious ones are the foundation of Constantinople, and boy, did he get that right. And his choice for, well, it's not entirely clear what he did with Christianity in the church, but at least he came out as a Christian and supported the church. And more than that, he normalized it within the imperial order, right? He didn't make it the official religion, but he kind of indicated that he was generally in support of it. And the rest is history. Like, that's been talked about more than any other aspect of his reign. I will add also his institution of the Roman gold coin, the solidus, at 72 to the Roman pound, where it remained thereafter for like the next 700 years. This was another very, very consequential move. And there's a host of other administrative reforms that are attached to his name. They become sort of progressively less important as you go down here. But just in the ones that we've mentioned, in terms of normalizing the church within imperial social order and the law, that is, creating a legal framework that would govern the church thereafter. Like, that's momentous. And this is not the triumph of Christianity as is often depicted. I mean, you can see it that way, but that's not really what happened. It's that the church got absorbed into the imperial social order and regulated by it. The Ecumenical Council of Nicaea, setting aside whatever it is that Nicaea decided, and some people, might believe, just based on their own, personal, like their belief and so on, that Nicaea is important because of the doctrine that it codified. But Nicaea is also important because it kind of established a template for ecumenical councils that was followed for many, many centuries thereafter in the East thereafter, and until the fall of Constantinople. In the West, until they gradually realized that, oh, wait, no, we can have councils without emperors, but that was later. So the whole idea of creating a governance structure in the church that was supra-regional, that's Constantine's. But also we can name all kinds of, administrative and military and so forth reforms, and also his actions. He's a very successful general. He generally knew how to handle people. So he could get angry sometimes, but generally he was successful in internal diplomacy, in projecting an image of himself that could satisfy a number of different constituencies, right? So to the Christians, he presented himself as a Christian. To his other subjects, he presented himself in ways that they found familiar. Think of his statue, right, in the form of Constantine in Constantinople that you mentioned, is a huge nude Apollo. So he had some subtlety to him, despite being a military person who spent his entire life in the camps. Like, this isn't a... And now, having said that, he was a murderous son of a bitch. I mean, he killed more of his own family than any other Roman emperor. It's amazing. Like, you did not want to be near this guy, especially related to him. That was by far the most dangerous position. The rest of his subjects, I'm pretty sure they all thought he was a very good emperor in all of the ways that the others were. In the East, right, or in the West as well, very good at defending the frontier, an administrator in the economy, and he made these very, very consequential decisions, which required a lot of money, and in part, he paid for a lot of that by the temple treasuries that he confiscated. So he put all of that gold into circulation. Well, that's a rather clinical economic way of describing what happened, but I'm sure the worshippers at those temples didn't appreciate that. But it's hard to argue that anybody else made more consequential decisions for the empire and was a better, more capable ruler than he was. Pretty capable in that regard. I just wouldn't want to get very near him. But yeah. So there you go. That's the list.
Well, that's fantastic. Now, obviously, I haven't studied him in detail, but do you think he needed to destroy the Tetrarchy the way he did? Would it have been better for the Roman world if he'd said, I'll be Western Emperor and you be Eastern Emperor and we'll call it a day? Or were there benefits to him sort of destroying all his enemies?
No, there weren't. This was just ambition, which again is sort of endemic to the Roman imperial system. I mean, it's anyway. He destroyed the Tetrarchy. It's not clear that Tetrarchy could have worked. Like, the wheels were already coming off before he decided to do anything. It sounds like a great idea to have this system of regular succession where people just kind of step down and it's not like biological and whatever. But I don't know that it would have been that viable. And in a sense, Constantine recreated the Tetrarchy. He just did it within his own family. Like, he left the empire to four heirs. They were just sons and nephews and whatever. His dynasty was the first in Roman history to reach the third generation, right? In part because of that.
Yeah.
And, he was, anyway. Yeah, I wouldn't judge Constantine too harshly for doing that because I'm not sure what viability the Tetrarchy had.
Mm. Do we get the sense that he chose the site of Byzantium for strategic reasons, or was it sort of the right empty space to build a new Rome for his own sort of political and PR benefits?
So that's a very big discussion.
That may be too big.
Yeah, so I can answer it quickly, and I can say that even though our sources do not explain, they don't really say anything about why he picked that site. I think I can make a convincing argument that it was for strategic reasons, but not the kind of strategic reasons that, say, a Leo III would have pointed to. In other words, I don't think Constantine was thinking about, hey, what happens if some enemy who's massively more powerful than the Roman Empire reaches the point where I'm going to build a city. Where do I want to build it? Like, I don't think he was thinking that way at all.
No.
In a nutshell, if you look at the history of pre-Constantinian Byzantium, the city, it was the fracture point where the Roman Empire would break. So a lot of the wars that had been fought in previous, like battles that were fought in previous civil wars, were there. And it was this kind of point because of the Bosporus, and that's where Asia and Europe meet and so forth. It was a natural place for the empire to break. And I think by putting it there, he clamped to the Balkans and Asia Minor, and by extension Syria, together, and it worked. So I credit his genius with that. I mean, I think Constantinople is not just this abstract thing that he founded that lasted for forever down to today. It was designed to do a very specific thing that it did, and then it turned out later it had even more strategic advantages than they had imagined. So yeah, points to him for that.
Well, I think that's a great list because ideally what I want in a list is what I did not expect to see, and some unusual names on there, given the usual thing you find on the internet. So I have to ask you about just a few big names, just briefly, I guess. I, like you, would not include Justinian on a top 10 list, but most people do. Why would you not?
Well, in his case, I think the negatives outweigh the positives. There's some, and in his case, they are massive in both categories.
Yes.
Like we're talking about gigantic accomplishments and gigantic blunders and destructive acts, like on a scale that these other emperors usually didn't meet. But for me, the negatives outweigh the positives, and I think most of the audience knows what those are. Yeah, Justinian kind of terrifies me.
Elaborate on that beyond the Nika riots.
No, I mean, this is a person who spent his entire reign minus two very small moments in the palace. Didn't get out, and was this kind of hub from where these endless instructions and orders and summons would come. And the processes by which he thought out and implemented all of these projects that he had, so many of them all at the same time. I mean, and don't get me wrong, Justinian was an impressive individual to be able to juggle all of this and to conceive all of this stuff, like, no doubt. But it's a very opaque process, and the mind behind them strikes me sometimes as very, very cold and calculating, and in almost in a modern way, he was comfortable with externalizing the costs and the damage of his policies to other people, even very, very large groups of people. From like almost with this kind of executive coldness that I don't know. It just kind of scares me. And it's possible you might say, okay, well, all emperors did that to a certain degree. Yeah, he did it to a very great degree. And since we have all of his legal texts, we can see how he chose to express himself. And I don't like what I see. Now that's very subjective. That's not what I base my assessment on. My assessment is based on like numbers,
Yes.
and he did incredible damage. So I would have preferred someone to do less, like Anastasius, and leave his subjects way better off.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. That's fascinating. I mean, I just want to have a whole conversation about what you see in his legal
Anytime.
text.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
that's another day. Okay, so Heraclius, a very popular choice on most.
Why would Heraclius even like? I'm sorry, I just don't see it.
No?
No.
You know, risking risking a lot to regain a lot, and having the competence to leave your capital, undefended by you, but know that it will be safe, and you know, clever strategic long war.
So Heraclius is more a figure for tragedy or some sort of dramatic play. I don't think he belongs on this list. So Heraclius, okay, let's set aside the very destructive civil war that he waged to become emperor.
Mm,
Again, I haven't counted that against other people, though his was particularly destructive.
mm.
They ruined Egypt, a province that hadn't yet been ruined. But anyway, um, I mean, all he really did was this one spectacular campaign in the Caucasus, for 1 year, where he basically dodged and defeated a series of Persian armies, only to end up back in Asia Minor with like it was a wash. Like he didn't gain anything. Okay, those maneuvers are very impressive, granted, but they didn't accomplish anything. And then next year, he pushes into Mesopotamia to defeat the Persian Empire. So that's one move, and it worked. I don't think that by itself is sufficient to put him on this list. In part because he lost all of it to the Arabs subsequently. His armies were just kept getting defeated over and over and over again, himself included, in the 30s when the Arabs arrived. And also, I'm not entirely sure that the knockout victory against the Persian Empire was entirely his doing. I think he had a massive army of Turks with him. Okay, so kudos for organizing that alliance and for making it happen. But there are places where you can see that his propaganda has kind of written the Turks out of the picture, but there are places where they're still there. And I think this was a joint effort. So what Heraclius essentially has to his name is one impressive virtuoso campaign in the Caucasus that accomplished very little, and then a sudden knockout blow with an ally. Okay. There's so many negatives that, yeah. Sorry.
No, fascinating. I mean, absolutely fascinating. But yeah, we can't really debate on and on for hours about that. But I think people will be very interested to know more. Honorable mentions, just very briefly, would Romanos Lycapinos, or
Yes.
one more, or John Komnenos. Would either of them be in the top 15? Or
Absolutely.
yeah, okay.
Absolutely. And even Basil the First.
Yeah. And Nicephorus Phocas somewhere
A bit below them.
Yeah.
Impressive general, no question. But I explained earlier why I don't think he was a good emperor.
Yeah. That is a fascinating list. Would
Yeah,
that
I hope to have provided some surprises too. I mean,
I
I
think
didn't
you
want
will.
it to be.
I am waiting for the endless stream of comments about Heraclius. Heraclius was the best. What are you talking about? Would that list, do you think, have been different before you wrote your history of Byzantium?
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, because I worked through all of these people on a very close level to write it. And this list might be different in 2 weeks if you ask me to do it again. Like, okay, I'm not, these are,
Yeah.
there's some subjective here. I'll grant that. But there are figures here whom before looking at them very closely in their situation. And that's what I've tried to do. I try to calibrate the sort of their ranking, as it were, based on the kind of situation that they had inherited. So, I will appreciate someone more if they rose to the throne under very, very difficult circumstances. Yes.
Final question. If you had to go for a beer with one of these 10, who would it be?
Let's see. Constantine V for sure. I think that would have been tremendous fun. Manuel I, possibly. Alexius, if I could have a private conversation. If there's no one watching and he can sort of let his hair down, as it were. Yes. Those are among the most interesting people, yeah.
Very, very good. Well, all I can say is thank you so much for that brilliant list, and for all the social media abuse you probably won't read about your choices.
No.
But I think fantastic. And yeah, may have to, I imagine when your book comes out, it's going to be very difficult for me to restrain myself in asking 150 different questions, but we'll try to do justice to the work you've done.
I'm always happy to do so, Robin, and I've lost count of the number of students who come up to me and say, I took your course because I was listening to Robin's podcast since forever.
Well, that's fantastic.
Yes, so thank you for all of that. A tremendous service to our field, I gotta say.
I'm really thrilled with that. That's brilliant. Well, thank you again, and we will speak to you again in a few months' time.
Thanks, Robin. Take care.